but we'll see. Are you gonna?
Are you selecting from the questions or asking all of them?
I don't think I will. Maybe the media I'm going to combine. And, let's go with it. Let's have a good conversation.
Yeah, I think it'll be more open-ended. All right, is it okay? You're good?
Yeah, this one's the last one. Because I looked at like notes for the different questions, trying to figure out like what to focus.
Sure. Yeah, I think we'll just a little like.
Okay.
That's okay.
Sounds good.
Okay. We're good.
You tell me when you want to start.
So Julia's gonna start it.
We'll start on
Okay.
10:05 on the dot, basically. I just want to give people,
I just
time
want to
to
share
wait.
that
You all right? I'm sorry, it's so rough. And I know you cancel class. I'm very sorry. I wish. Okay, good. And just so you know, they're recording this, and then YouTube is gonna like package.
Yeah, this one.
That's a very random question. Sorry for the phony. I don't even know what those.
You look fantastic. I mean, you should do what you feel most comfortable, but you look fantastic. So
I think I should. I have a
What do you think?
I trust your judgment. No, it's totally fine. I trust your judgment. But really, you look good. But
It's an hour and a half.
I was gonna say YIVO is gonna. I mean, they're recording it, and then they'll like package it. Will be nice, and they're gonna put it on YouTube. So I'm just saying, it's not just the whatever goes here. So it'll be, yeah. I mean, not to. I'm not saying it to freak you out. I'm saying it. You should feel good about it. That like, it's not just the people here. It's gonna be have a longer. Shelf life or whatever. All right. You're good. You're okay. All right. Well, I mean, I'm happy to talk afterwards or whatever another time about teaching. Like, it is a lot. It's a lot. And children. I mean, my kids. I just a little bit older, but you know, when I started, but like, it is a lot. Not that I have any great secrets or something, but I'm happy to.
How does it feel like this?
Helpful. If you're interested at all, more than happy to do it. Of course. Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with thinking about sustainability. No, really, I think it's a good thing. I think this. Wait, is this a full-time job? Is this?
This is a full-time role. It's 3 years.
Oh.
And what they do is, at this school, they told me that.
You are lucky to get. That's a very good gig.
But not only that, the other part is that I don't know if I'll fix it, but they said that basically, after 3 years, if funding permits, then they can do it to 10 years.
Oh, wow.
That was what they set up for.
That's remarkable. But you should. I mean, I don't.
That's the thing. I
Well,
don't
no,
know if I need to let go of
no.
so easily.
Right, no, but so okay, we have to talk on a longer conversation, but very quickly. I would say on the one hand, quote unquote, you should be happy, meaning this is a great gig, you should know that. But at the same time, I don't mean that you have a right to be exhausted or questioned. Of course, everyone does. You know what I mean? So, you know, we were talking the whole day yesterday, you know, panels, like.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to day 2 of After Orthodoxy. We are so excited to have you join us. My name is Julia Rothkopf. I'm the Public Programs Associate at YIVO. And yesterday we had a full day of this conference and the festival. We had musical performances, comedy, poetry, and lots of talks, all very illuminating, and it really occurred to me and my colleagues who work at YIVO just how important this history is to YIVO and how it relates to our current collections in our stacks in our library. So thank you all for being here. Today, Naomi Seidman is unfortunately not here, so we are going to start with a panel about the changing face of OTD, and Jessica Rhoda kindly stepped in to moderate, and then we will do a panel on going back to where you came from, and then we will conclude with some closing remarks from Zalman Newfield. So thank you everyone for joining, and we are so happy to have you back.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. So my name is Jessica Rhoda. Maybe you wonder why I'm here also. So I know those wonderful panelists this morning. I wrote a book about ultra-Orthodox female artists and the one who left. It's called For Women and Girls Only. So maybe we'll have a great conversation about the changing face of OTD. And before getting started into the conversation, I'm going to present our three wonderful panelists, and I'm going to read, because even if I know all of them and their great work, you know, it's important to have it right. So first of all, we have Jessica Lang. So she's a professor of English and the dean of the George and Mildred Westman School of Art and Science at Baruch College. Her areas of specialization span early American fiction and Jewish American and Holocaust literature. Her numerous publications include Textual Silence and the book Of the Derech, Living Orthodox Judaism. Dr. Lang is the founding Newman Director of the Baruch Sandra Kahn Wasserman Jewish Studies Center. So welcome, Professor Lang. Then we have, whoops, I have all the, it's falling apart. Miriam Moster. So Miriam Moster is a visiting assistant professor of sociology at Wagner's College. Her dissertation, entitled Inadvertent Exit, Divorce in the Haredi Community, explores the relationship between divorce and religious exit among members of the Haredi community. She holds a PhD in sociology from the Graduate Center CUNY and an MFA in creative writing from Hunter College. Welcome, Professor Mester. I'm bringing all the title. And okay, I'm going to try to put that here. It's going to be a little bit annoying. And our last and wonderful panelist and organizer also of this great conference with Naomi Sedman, Schneur Zalman Newfield. He's an associate professor of sociology and Jewish studies at Hunter College, City University of New York, and the author of the book, Degrees of Separation, Identity Formation While Living Ultra-Orthodox Judaism, published in 2020. Newfield is also a host on the Jewish Studies channel of the New Books Network podcast and the founder of the Bridge to College Initiative, a Hunter College pilot program designed to assist those lacking formal secular education to acclimate to the college environment. So welcome to our three panelists and welcome to the audience here and on Zoom. So the questions that we have today to engage in the discussion are a lot about, indeed, change and the relationship between the OTD community and the Haredi community. And I would like to start by entering this question about the transformation of the Haredi community throughout the year, especially when you started your own research. How do you see the response of the Haredi community internally transforming regarding the idea of religious deviance, religious doubt, and also the idea of people who do not fit in? And here, when you think about Haredi community, it's a big, category. But what are the transformations that you have seen, throughout the years? So maybe we'll do a little. Yes.
Okay, so I'll talk about two areas where I've seen this. One is in my dissertation research, things that I've come across, and the other is I recently designed a survey for a collaborative project between Shtetl, a news agency that covers the Haredi community, and Nishma Research, a research agency directed by Mark Trencher. And this survey asked people a whole host of questions about their experience in the Haredi community and exiting the Haredi community. And what was unique about this is we surveyed both Haredi insiders and the people who left, so we can look at their responses comparatively. And one of the questions we asked them was, do you think the Haredi community has changed in the way it responds to basically deviance in the Haredi community? And I'll tell you, I noted the results to be able to share with you. So they had three options. Do you think the Haredi community has become more inclusive of people who are deviant and less shunning of them since about 5 years ago? Do you think they've stayed mostly the same, or do you think they've become less inclusive of people who are deviant and more shunning of them? And among people who are Haredi, nearly 2/3 thought that the Haredi community has become much better, much nicer, and more inclusive. But surprisingly, even among people who leave, nearly half of them, 48%, shared that they also felt that the Haredi community is more inclusive today than they were 5 years ago. And then among ex-Haredim, nearly half thought they stayed the same. It was 46%, and about 1/3 of Haredim thought they stayed the same. And only 6% of former Haredim and 2% of current Haredim thought that the community had grown any worse than it was 5 years ago. So there's certainly a feeling among both the people who leave and the people who stay that the community is warming to deviance and treating it differently. And this is something that I've also seen on the ground in my research. So I'll give you an example. It's the case study of New Square. New Square, as many of you might know, it's a village up in Rockland County. It's a very insular village. Of all Hasidic sects, it's one of the most insular there is. And in New Square, there was a really famous and really horrifying and sad suicide case about maybe a decade or a little more ago of a woman who got divorced. She left the community. She was shunned, alienated from her kids, and she ultimately committed suicide. And we're not hearing these kinds of stories. And this was like almost like a typical, not typical. New Square's, I mean, suicide is not typical, but the shunning, the degree of shunning was more typical back then that we saw, especially from New Square. So they were always more extreme than other sects. But over the course of my research, I was interviewing people from the New Square community, and they were telling me that in recent years, things have changed. And I tried to understand why things have changed. And what I learned was that New Square had outgrown its space. There just wasn't enough room for the people who lived in New Square to keep living there. And so they started creating new rules. In the past, if you exhibited any deviance, you were shunned because they were keeping their community really pure. And they had enough room for everybody. So you either stayed and you towed the line perfectly, or you were cast aside. And then, as they started outgrowing their space and there wasn't room, they needed a way to manage this kind of space problem, right? So they have more people than they have space for, and now, instead of saying you want to leave your shunned, like before in the past, if you wanted to even leave outside the borders of New Square, your family would become very disconnected from you, even if you wanted to stay religious, even if you wanted to stay skver. And there are skver outposts. There are other skver communities. New Square is skver Hasidic outside of New Square. But if you left New Square, the village, you would be shunned, even if your intention was to remain religious. And then as they outgrew their space, suddenly they need people to leave the village. So now they're managing deviance in a different way. Instead of shunning, they're actually trying to encourage people to move to these more moderate outposts. Now, by moderate, it's still extreme. They're still Hasidic, but they're more moderate than New Square, which is more extreme than most Hasidic sects. So, I mean, this comports with, can I get a little into the literature, the academic literature? So Kai Erikson is a sociologist who has a theory of deviance, and he says that societies have a certain capacity for deviance, and you kind of see deviance staying kind of consistent at that threshold because they have a certain capacity for managing it. And he gives the example of prisons. When you run out of space in your prisons, you have to redefine crime because you have no more place to put them. And that's what he was studying a Puritan society. And you kind of see this happening here. It's kind of the opposite. When you run out of space for the good people, you have to redefine deviance too. And that's what you see happening in New Square. And you see something similar happening in the Litvish community, but in a different way. They're managing their space crisis differently. So in the Litvish community, what I'm finding is they're running out of spaces in their schools. So they have a capacity problem there, and they're almost like they have these limitations. You can't accept everyone, and they're almost creating a deviance problem in the Litvish community because they don't have enough space for their own. So who are they going to exclude from their high schools? Who's not going to be accepted? In a way that kind of creates a deviance problem. You're kind of branding these kids, not giving them a space. So I think with the changing face of acceptance in these communities or the changing relationship, a lot has to do with the capacity of these communities, the amount of resources and amount of space they have for their own that's motivating these shifts.
That's really fascinating. When I think about this question, I'm reminded of the analysis that I wrote about in my book, looking specifically at the Lubavitch and the Satmar community and what happens to people who change their religious status in some way, and how do those communities respond to them. And as I noted in my research, that there's a stark difference between how Lubavitch and Satmar deals with this issue, and basically the Satmar community is a lot harsher in their response, but that what I found, and I should note, given they're talking about the change in attitudes and responses over time, so my research is based on data that I collected about, well, at this point it's about I guess about 10 years ago. So I do think that things have changed in the interim. So again, what I found was that both communities were very hostile towards people who were leaving, but that Satmar was more severe in its response. And I would say over the past over the intervening period, things have definitely gotten better, but I think that there's a complicated dynamic here, because certainly from the perspective of the Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox community, I think there's an attempt to say, look, we're so loving, we're so kind, we're embracing the people who are deviating religiously. We, allow our family members to come back home and visit, and we stay connected to them or whatever. So the point is that I think we have to realize that this, there's empirical questions, what is going on in the ground, but at the same time, there's rhetorical posturing that's happening as well. So, and the rhetorical element of it, or the sort of the discourse around this issue gets very complicated, because everyone has different motives at play. So again, the ultra-Orthodox community, both for internal consumption and certainly when they are talking to outsiders or talking to the media, they have a certain interest in trying to present themselves in a very positive way that shows how flexible they are religiously. And then I think in a way the motivations become even more complicated when we think about the ex-Orthodox community itself. On the one hand, I think that a lot of people who leave, that I call exiters, a lot of them have a deep desire to stay connected to their families in some way. But I think that because a lot of people who leave the ultra-Orthodox community were in some ways traumatized by their experience in the ultra-Orthodox community and their experience leaving it, I think in some ways some people, some part of the exiter community also has a kind of interest in highlighting the ways that they're still disconnected or still not embraced to the extent that they want to be. So it becomes very complicated, in other words, to really get at the empirical situation. But I definitely think that things are improving. So for instance, some ex-Orthodox Hasidic people talk about, are excited about the fact that one of the big Hasidic rebbes recently came out and told his community that it's important to embrace the members of their community who have left. We shouldn't shun them. We should, love them, and so on. And so some in the ex-Hasidic community look at this as a positive sign and say, oh, wow, things have improved so much. And then others take a more cynical view and say, well, maybe this whole kind of warm and fuzzy campaign is really just a subtle or not so subtle attempt to try to do kiruv, to try to do outreach on us, to try to kind of get us back. So which is it? I don't know. But the point is, I think that it's worth both noting that a major Hasidic Rebbe came out and said something like this, but also to think about the possible motivations for him or for the members of his community in engaging in this kind of friendly approach towards the ex-Hasidic community, knowing full well that the Hasidic community itself fundamentally does not accept the personal religious decisions that its former members have made, and that fundamentally they would like them to come back. So we need to keep all of these aspects in mind as we analyze the shifting approach of the ultra-Orthodox to its former members.
Thank you. I'm going to kind of translate the question into my particular lens, which is literature. And as Zalman was talking, I realized there's a mechitza here between the sociologists and the literary folks. So, but that's okay. Oh, you're anthropology. Well, you do film too, so you're an arts person. I'm gonna count you as one of mine. As a literature scholar, we like to look at long trends, so not 5 years, but like 50 years, in order to really, it takes like most people 5 years to write a novel. So like that's not extraordinary. So that feels a little too quick. So I wanted to just identify probably, and people may be a little astonished to think of these works as off the derech, but I'm going to go for it And in the mid-20th century, so in the 1950s, 1960s, the two most popular, let's call them off the derech, works of literature were Chaim Potak's The Chosen, which came out in the 1960s, and Elie Wiesel's Night, which came out initially in the late 50s and then went through a couple editions and really took off in the second half of the 20th century. And I think you all know, like Oprah, it's remained on the bestseller list for decades. And if you just look at these two volumes, one's fictional, one's memoir, and think about the authorship and the position of the author to the story they're telling, it's a very kind of traditional model of narrator. It's what we might consider conventional, right? It's a man narrating stories about either himself or a version. With Potak, it was somewhat autobiographical, about other men, engaging. One went through the Holocaust, so a major crisis of faith brought on by global events. The other, it was a familial thing, and there's a whole discussion with Potak and that kind of dialectic between modernism, modernity, and religious practice. And the upshot for both was a departure from the belief system of the community of origin. And if you look 50, 60, even 70 years later to the current body of literature that we now identify as off the derech, it looks really, really different. And that's really the point I want to make, about just larger literary trends. We have queer people writing. We have many more formally published memoirs written by women than men. And I think they're really interesting. I think that's an interesting question, is to ask why. Women tend to be kind of more on the inside of these communities, of ultra-Orthodox, Orthodox communities. And then they go public with a memoir. I mean, it's really, an exposure to a degree that, they never have experienced while they're in their community of origin. We have, it's documentation that people are writing oftentimes as they are en route to departure, right? There's all sorts of different phases of exiting, and Zalman's written a fantastic book about the sociological processes. But often we're now seeing that technology offers a means for exiters to kind of document through blogging, through different kinds of diaristic impulses, their phases of departure. And there's an interesting story written by Frida Wiesel, a kind of graphic memoir, very short, where she documents exactly this and the influence of technology. So while I completely accept your argument that the communities, like the native communities, ultra-Orthodox communities, have become more receptive, I also want to say that people have become more outspoken as our society has shifted as well. We are sympathetic to protagonists who leave their communities because they identify in a way as profoundly different, whether it's because of how they identify or because of the kind of life they want to lead or profession they want to hold. We as a society have evolved as well, and publishing has evolved, like the whole industry has evolved. I want to make one more comment about a moment of stasis that I think endures, and that is the fetishization of the ultra-Orthodox community. We just love reading about these people, and there's a long-standing, if you go back, even you look back at 16th, 17th century literature globally, there's a fascination with the Jews, the conversion of the Jews, the secularization of the Jews. And I think that the public marketplace, which drives much of the reading material that we have available to us, also plays a really important role in this. And if anything, the success of this, really rich body of literature, which I think of as a new turn to American Jewish literature, off the derech memoir and storytelling, also speaks to a desire that I think is like hypersexualized and like intrusive and lurid in many ways. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, by the way, but let's just acknowledge that it exists. regarding these stories, the stories that they generate coming out of ultra-Orthodox communities about what goes on behind closed doors in ultra-Orthodox communities, the kind of insularity that's being exposed. So there's a real marketplace feature to this as well. And Potok and Wiesel to some degree as well, Potok definitely tapped into that very early on. So I'll stop there.
Sorry, if I could just add one thing to your last comment, because Naomi Seidman is not here with us today, but she wrote a wonderful review of the Netflix show Unorthodox. Her review is in the Jewish Review of Books, and she basically highlighted this point and kind of flipped the script, where for some time now we have all of these memoirs about sort of sexual experiences, sexual abuse, and so on, sexual discovery from ex-Orthodox people. And she basically said, well, we've been focusing so much on the ex-Orthodox, and then by extension on the Orthodox community itself, but we haven't spent any time looking at the people who are doing the looking. You know, and she talks about like the secular society is like at the peeking through the keyhole of the Orthodox community voyeuristically, you know, gazing at them. And she talks about the secular gaze. You know, what's happening with the secular community? What are they getting out of all of these sexualized portrayals of the Orthodox community, of the ex-Orthodox members? You know, and she talks about how these types of narratives feed into a kind of secular triumphalism, you know, that says essentially the secular community was right all along. Of course, you know, being secular, being atheist, whatever, is the right way. Of course, the religious are backwards and benighted, you know, and what better way to reinforce this? Hey, look at these quote-unquote escape narratives of the ex-Orthodox and see how much they suffered when they were in the community, how they suffered when they were trying to leave it. You know, obviously, you know, we're right and the Orthodox community is wrong. And so I think, obviously, as scholars, so as social scientists of all different stripes, we're keenly aware that all actors in any social context have motivations, have desires, have agendas. But I think that when we look at the sort of popular literature on the ex-Orthodox phenomenon, it's easy to forget this and just kind of focus on really minutely the experience of the ex-Orthodox without asking why are these particular kinds of narratives being promoted, being published, being celebrated, as opposed to the plethora of other types of narratives that go, you know, unnoticed.
I just wanted to make two comments on because I think it's a very interesting conversation about the portrayed and the feed narrative. I think and because this question is about changes in terms of the Haredi, I think also the OTD community, I mean, this institutionalization also of a community, instead of having, you know, individual narrative, has also drastically changed. And this constant dynamic between both sides, and in terms of the trajectory that everybody is trying to make to convince, we were all trying to convince ourselves when we make choices in our life that we are making the best choices. And then we do that as community and as group. And I think everybody is doing that. And you know, those narrative of fetishization, can you help me? Fetishization, you also have it in the Frum world, in the Haredi world, in terms of how the secular world. So there's kind of this back and forth on looking at each other. And by looking at each other, I think, and that's for later about the representation in the media, this is also how changes occurred, right? I think that by observing how people are talking about ourselves at different levels, encourage, and also through different medium, encourage, you know, community or individual to make transformation. And I wanted to say something about how the community also changed. What is fascinating is to see how many, you know, diversity within the community, to make sure that also people would not necessarily completely draw the line of, you know, becoming fully secular or rejecting everything. And that's something, I don't know what you think about that, but the number of organizations also within, and also in terms of the popular representation, the diversity, as you said, also, of voices. And in a way, also sometimes to say, I'm able to stay in and to have this life of navigating the multiple worlds, the in-between worlds. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that. So this is definitely something that we're seeing more of, people being deviant and still being included in the community, included in the family much more. And I think a big part of this goes back to what I was saying about capacity. Like at a certain point, when your deviance levels, your numbers start rising, you're either going to label everyone deviant and have a lot of outsiders, or you're going to change your definitions and keep them on the inside. But it also is important in the way this is actually happening on the ground and how that's transforming the community itself. So there's more openness inside. I don't know if we have any Mishpacha magazine readers in this audience, but I do sometimes read the Mishpacha magazine, and it really gives you an insight into the inner thinking of the religious community. So probably within the last month, there was an article written by a mother in Mishpacha magazine about her son, and her son stopped keeping, and at first she tried to crack down, and she talks about how harsh she was within her family and so afraid other kids would leave, and this fear. And then at some point she transformed, and this really mirrors a transformation within the community itself, and started noticing, okay, my son is not keeping this and that and the other thing, but look, he's really kind and he helps around the family. And I mean, I'm not representing the story perfectly because I didn't just read it, but maybe it was he's still davening, or he still sometimes wears tefillin or something like that. He's still keeping some things. So it's this kind of fluidity of the religious identity that's becoming more acceptable and allows them to embrace the kids who are leaving, allows kids to tell themselves, I'm not keeping this, but I'm still on the inside. It's this different way of looking at deviance that we see taking place. There was another Mishpacha magazine article around Shavuos time. It really gives you a window into the inner workings of the Haredi mind and the Haredi family and the Haredi social unit. This one was about a woman who got married. I think her husband was at first in kollel when she first got married, or at least learning very regularly. And then over time, he stops learning as much. He's not learning Torah as a vocation. She realizes he's not even keeping Sidarim. He's not even really learning every day. So he's getting together with his chavrusa, with his study partner, and they're just chatting. It becomes a social hour for them. And when she picked up on that, it was really harrowing for her at first. But then over time, she made peace with it. This is her husband. And she said that she still lets Shavuos, the holiday of Torah, be the time that she mourns the life that she thought she would lead. But she realizes she has a husband who keeps all the mitzvos, who helps her, takes care of her kids, who's observant in every other way. So, and again, it's the same kind of fluidity that you're seeing, or this balance that people are reaching, where it might not be this perfect life, this perfect kollel Torah life maybe that she envisioned, or this perfect child that the mother thought she would raise, but they're okay with that gray area now. There's more acceptance of that.
So if I may add, and it combined with Jessica Lang's also transformation in novel, as long as also there is this keeping the traditional structural model of family, I think, or the don't ask, don't tell. But what is interesting and it goes back to also with what's happening in society, in general. If you want to be queer, you can't. That's very, very, and also the difference between being public. The novel of Sarah Glass is a great example. Being public about your sexual identity, or being in the closet about your sexual identity, and how long are you maintaining that? And this transformation of the publicity of recognizing or accepting different types of family. And I let you, and then I will ask the second question actually about family structure.
If I could just add on to what Miriam was saying, and we touched on this, I think, in different ways in panels yesterday, but I think it's always, anytime we're talking about the ultra-Orthodox or Orthodox community and ex-Orthodox people, I think it's really worth remembering that these are all moving targets, right? So when I like I said, I collected my data on the Satmar and Lubavitch exiters, people who left those communities about 10 years ago. Lubavitch has changed in the past 10 years. So has Satmar, for all sorts of based on internal dynamics, based on external dynamics. Miriam is mentioning about New Square and some of the spatial issues and housing and things like that. But all these communities have different, dynamics that they're dealing with, and they're evolving. So, of course, as scholars, as researchers, we're going to continue to analyze and think about and talk about these communities. But we have to always remember that these communities are changing. And so, yes, there's a greater openness to ex-members of these communities, but these communities themselves internally have gone through all sorts of changes over the past decade, let's say. I remember when I was growing up in Crown Heights in Brooklyn in the Lubavitch community, 30 years ago or whatever, it was like a real taboo thing for boys to learn English, to learn secular subjects. It's still a very big issue, and there's organizations that are trying to improve the situation, but there certainly are families that are providing some modicum of secular instruction to their own family members on a regular basis. I remember being struck that recently I went to Mendy's, which is a restaurant on Kingston Avenue, sort of in the heart of the Crown Heights community, Lubavitch community, and the Mendy's, which is a very kosher meat restaurant, they had a big publicity that you could get, I don't know, some kind of cold cuts or chicken fingers or whatever it was, some platter for the Super Bowl. And here come, you could get, Mendy's Super Bowl package. And I was shocked. I was there with my daughter, and I gave her a half an hour speech about it. Like, this is unheard of. I mean, when I was a kid, having a television was this a taboo thing. I mean, people had televisions. My family had a television. There were all sorts of rules about what we were allowed to watch and when and whatever. But the point is that the Lubavitcher Rebbe was vehemently opposed to his followers having televisions. He said having a television is like bringing the church into your house. It was this terrible thing to do, And so people may have had a television, but they didn't talk about it. It was shameful. I remember one kid, a bully, when I was in yeshiva, wanted to really make fun of me, so he told the whole class that Newfield has a television. And this was like a terribly embarrassing thing for everyone to know that Newfield's family watches TV, And now Mendy's has a huge poster saying, hey, come get the buffalo wings for the Super Bowl. Like, again, this is not, secular education per se, and it's not necessarily dealing with ex-members or whatever, but these things, of course, are all interrelated. And the fact that the Lubavitch community in the heartland, we're not talking about in the periphery in some outpost somewhere, we're talking about the Lubavitch heartland itself changing its standards and its what it considers acceptable culturally and socially. And I think this has obvious impacts on how it treats its ex-members and how where is the line in terms of how modern you could be while still being an upstanding member of the community?
I'll just chime in very briefly, just to say I completely agree with everything, but I do think that there are hard limits. We do not see queer families in Haredi communities. People who want to live publicly as a same-sex couple. There's lots of records and documentation of queerness being underground and existing in these communities and has been for centuries. But you just don't find families, two dads, two moms living openly in the Satmar community. And so yes, like TVs are, and you can watch football, all male violent sport, but loving queer families, still we haven't evolved, and I don't see any suggestion that will be acceptable in the near future. And I just raise this because one of the there's a core group of memoirists and writers who identify as queer coming out of ultra-Orthodoxy, documenting, really painful struggles, but also a kind of celebration of their queerness, of their differences. And there's amazing advocacy and support groups that have been built around this community able to offer them support now, more publicly. So that's been a shift. But within the community, not so much.
And I would say it goes back to the idea of the family and the family structure, because the same thing, you still, if you need to have large families, right? This model of, select, okay, I want 1 or 2 kids, or maybe I don't want any children. As a choice, that's not something that it would, so this is always this question, as long, all those, the question of practice, religion. I remember having this fascinating discussion with Shulam Din, like this understanding that the fact that he was not religious was not necessarily, something that was a core, but that it became an excuse as long as it's not public. And the other aspect is also as long as you keep the family, you can push, but there are certain limits. If you push towards a different model, of family structure and dynamic, then there is, and I would say maybe divorce is also part of this, and you're working on that. So maybe now the second question would be actually about family dynamic, and even in terms of the OTD community, people leaving the community and the family that decided to have, and the correlation between the acceptance on the choices that they make in terms of their, their personal life and their level of acceptance. So that on one level, how do you see the transformation between the relationship between both? And the second question is about internal relationship also, if you've seen, and maybe also in the literature and the representation, one parent or one person who is completely publicly non-religious, not in the closet, saying publicly and in front of the parents, the kids, and the other who stays, frum. Is it something that is possible? Or did you see it as kind of recognized and accepted?
Yeah, I'll start. This goes exactly to the heart of my research. I'm happy to talk about it. I studied divorce in the Haredi community, and so divorcees have a much harder time leaving because they're breaking apart a family unit, which is so integral to the Haredi way of life. And another difference between divorcees who leave and the typical exiter that leaves and has this easier time and is more accepted is their position in life. So when a teenager leaves, they're leaving, a teenager who's being rebellious, they're not as much a threat to the system. When a young adult leaves, they're not as much a threat to the system. It's just one isolated exiter. They're not breaking apart a family. They're not breaking apart the structure. And the other thing is at that time in their life, there's less control over them, especially for young adults, right? They're out of the Haredi school system. If they're not yet married, they're kind of at loose ends. They're not as moored and anchored in Haredi life as the young child who's really rooted in the school system under parental control, under school control, or the young or growing family. So the school is a really central feature of Haredi life. It's a locus of both control and socialization in Haredi life, and not only for the children enrolled in the school, but for the entire family. Schools have rules. They give out rule books, guidebooks in the beginning of the year, and these handbooks have rules for the children who attend the school and for the parents who send their kids to that school. So often, even though the community is tolerant of deviance among the teenagers, the teenage population more, and the young adults, if they keep them in long enough that these kids get married, then at some point they're sending their kids to Haredi schools, and they again become under the control of Haredi authority, and they become reincorporated in that way. So that's the key distinction you see. And it's also why you see a much harsher response when families try to leave, or when families break apart and one parent tries to exit. Because now they're already under the domain of this religious structure, of the school structure. And then it becomes much harder to exit, and the community becomes much less tolerant of deviance in those situations.
I'll just add that, so I mentioned previously that the Satmar community, I found in my research that the Satmar community responded more harshly to people leaving than the Lubavitch community. One of the ways that I document this has to do with divorce. And, with child custody coming out as a result of divorce. And so basically I found that in the Satmar community, if one parent stayed in the community and one parent left, often the parent that left would find that the entire community lined up to support the parent who stayed. And so they would provide financial support for lawyers, for just the maintenance of the family, in order to show the court that the parent who stayed is not only religious, but is the best parent. They're able to take care of the children and have full custody of the children. Whereas the parent who left, the community would often hire investigators to find them doing something that seemed disreputable or chaotic or unstable or whatever, to show the courts or to claim for the courts, oh, look, this person is mentally unbalanced and shouldn't have custody. And my research, I found that the Lubavitch community did this much less often, but that the Satmar community, this was sort of par for the course. This was for the people, ex-Satmar people that I spoke to, they basically expected their community to come out and support the parent who stayed. So, and as Miriam said, that once the issue of children came into play, the community felt that they sort of had ownership of those children. Whereas if it was just a single person, obviously the community would prefer for those members to stay, but if they want to go, okay, that's their business. So yes, the issue of divorce, issue of the status of the family, and I think that it does make a lot of sense that relates to the issue of queer people and how much less tolerance or lack of tolerance there is when it comes to queer members of the Hasidic community. Yeah.
Let me just follow up with a question of my own, because in reading a wide survey of memoir and literature on exiting and family structures that have been disrupted is like the nicest way of putting it. I also notice a real division or like a hierarchy of practice that I wonder if you as sociologists have studied or recognized yourselves. So the first is that men who leave the community do not get their children. Like I don't know a single example, but maybe you do. And women who leave the community have a higher success rate, but if those women come out as gay, they have to there are some stories that are fairly well documented, but it involved very public court cases. And what I see as part of the dynamic that's playing out is a public and kind of American secular dynamic that privileges motherhood, in divorce cases, and kind of provides that tension against a Haredi, ultra-Orthodox, or Orthodox community that can mobilize, really intensive resources, legal resources, and so on, to make the case for a paternal control. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about this. Okay, it's very true that men who leave have a hard time getting their children. But the thing I want to add is men who stay have a hard time getting custody of their children. So in a divorce case where both parents remain Haredi, the status quo, the standard based in agreement prioritizes the mother for custody. It's a very traditional arrangement. I interviewed, when I was doing my research, I was interviewing people both who stayed Haredi after their divorce and those who left, and some of them shared their custody arrangements with me. So in one case, there was a custody arrangement where the mother got custody of the kids, but custody would be revisited if her ex-husband were to remarry. They both stayed religious, but unless there's a mother in these children's life, the presumption is custody is with the mother. I interviewed fathers who shared that when they got divorced, they had this very loving relationship with their kids. They wanted to maintain that relationship, and people around them looked at them like they were crazy, almost like that was a sign that there was something even religiously deviant about them, because why would a father want to have so much time with his kids? You don't cook dinner, you don't take care of them, you're not a mother. So there's these very clear gender roles in the Haredi community that you see coming, that really come into play in these divorces. And I think they're only magnified in the Exeter ones because those are the stories we're hearing about. Those are the ones who leave and who talk about it. And on the inside, many people will take these arrangements for granted. Now, this is not the case across the board. Sometimes fathers will get more custody than in other cases. It also depends. If a father wants more custody and the mother doesn't care, that's different. But usually, standard, the fathers don't really have that kind of access to the kids in these arrangements.
Wait, I want to go back to the second part of your question. I
Yes.
realized I didn't address it. So it seems to me this is, really more anecdotal. I didn't do, my own research on this, but I have seen, some friends or people on social media that I'm connected to who one parent became publicly ex-Orthodox, and they stayed married to an Orthodox Lubavitch partner. So again, I think statistically this is probably quite rare, but I think it's interesting, even if there's just a few cases of it, because again, thinking of the how things have shifted over the past few decades, at least to me, I can't imagine that kind of arrangement lasting or being acceptable, for any period of time, 20, 30 years ago. So I think that, again, relating to how the ultra-Orthodox community views religious shifts in people's religious identity in general, I think it also impacts families where both partners want to stay in the community, but one of them has publicly come out as no longer Orthodox.
Mm-hmm. And I think it goes also to how individuals also have a certain agency in this sense. We talk always about the community, but also how transformation are making, because as you said, people are speaking out, people are writing, and they're pushing boundaries and making the decision in their own relationship. We can't, there is maybe the authority, but also people at the end of the day, they decide that they make arrangement, and they see what they have to lose in case of they're taking this direction or the other one. But I think, to expand on, how is it, because we're talking about all those dynamic, in terms of making decisions in life that are different and that will lead to different type of trajectory for children. How is it different than the rest of society? We're talking about shared custody and motherhood. I mean, it's a very American and acceptance of queerness. I mean, we are in a country where now we have to fight again for abortion, right? So maybe not in New York, but I mean, this is a kind of a very big, just the right to be able to have access. It's not about discussing or, is it right or not, just to have this right. So how is it, different or an American, story in terms of those dynamic? I don't know what you have to say about that. And the acceptance of deviancy, and maybe the how it is called by this Puritanism, American Puritanism. I don't know. I'm going out from the
No. I'm sure everyone has a lot of thoughts. I just want to say, yes, I think that, David Myers wrote, and his wife, Naomi Stolzenberg, wrote a wonderful book about Kiryas Joel, one of the two main Satmar communities in the New York area, and it's called American Shtetl. And their whole argument is that when we think about Satmar, we should think of this as an American story, that this is not some isolated thing that, I mean, they're focusing particularly on sort of how the Satmar community in Kiryas Joel uses the secular courts to maneuver about housing and real estate and all sorts of land use issues, whatever. But I would argue that more broadly that the kinds of dynamics that we see, the kind of shift to the sort of political, cultural right that we see in the Haredi and the ultra-Orthodox community, it mirrors and is directly related to political shifts that we see in America more broadly. Some scholars talk about how with the last election, when we see the support for Trump in the areas of some areas in Brooklyn and other ultra-Orthodox enclaves was as high or higher than support for Trump in places like Alabama, and that's not a surprise that these things are deeply intertwined. And I think when we think about issues of homophobia and anti-queer sentiment yes, these are not isolated from the general homophobia and anti-queer sentiment that's prevalent in so much of American society. So, and I think that it really helps us as analysts to realize the connection between the dynamics that are going on in the ultra-Orthodox community and broader social dynamics that are going on in America. And we could even say globally, there's a rise in the political right all around the world. These dynamics are very, very much interconnected, and we gain in a depth of our understanding when we think about the ultra-Orthodox community in relation to these other broader forces.
So this is such a complex question that you're asking, but I want to just offer a few reflections because it's I think a huge topic. I'm not going to touch the Puritans. It's just too big. I think COVID and the period during COVID, where communal life was impacted in Jewish communities, created a bridge to the Christian right that didn't exist before. And this has been talked about a little bit, but so if for people who aren't familiar with the dynamic, if you remember, Governor Cuomo forbade religious houses of worship from gathering because public gatherings were considered a public health hazard. And so, especially in Brooklyn and in the ultra-Orthodox communities, but more broadly than that, churches and Shtiblach, they came together. They were united in this understanding that it was intrinsic to their way of life and it was un-American, essentially, and really pushed back. And it created a really interesting and maybe inevitable, partnership between two groups that have a lot of difference between them. And I just want to, because you brought up abortion, enunciate that that's one of the big differences between them. I mean, the pro-life kind of doctrine of the Christian right does not live in the same space that the family values in religious Judaism. I'm being a little broader than just ultra-Orthodoxy. That it lives there. Abortion is permitted. Okay. But yes, I know with guardrails and rules and so on, but it's not nearly as, if you look at the religious right, it doesn't have that same absolute 100% ban. It might be inching towards that. I don't know. But
It seems to me that the difference, there is a difference between the ultra-Orthodox community's attitude towards abortion and the Christian right's attitude, but it's not so much in the details of the permissibility or impermissibility of abortion, although there are some differences. I think the bigger differences is in terms of the order of priorities, that for the Christian right, this is maybe the first, the second, the third, the most important thing that we need to talk about, that we need to focus on. In the Haredi, in the ultra-Orthodox community, there are other things that they might consider, the primary things to focus on. But if you ask ultra-Orthodox Jews in general, do they support abortion or whatever, they say no. I know our colleague, Michal Rauscher, is doing wonderful work on Jewish and even Orthodox support for abortion, but my understanding is that again, there's details, there's sort of specific cases where abortion might be permissible from ultra-Orthodox perspective, but in general, I think the kind of general attitude towards abortion is still very negative, but it's just not as high up on the priorities of the ultra-Orthodox community as it is for the Christian right.
I'm sorry to have, expanded the question related to, how it is, an American story. I'm just going to go back now, maybe to popular representation of exoders, the idea of leaving the community and how the last 10, 15 years, this transformation and potentially the response from different, and the response also from inside, from the community itself, of people, who left the community and how they saw or they see this, this portrayed, and I see in media, but also through memoirs. So that's the first part of my question. And the second one, just because, Jessica, you just mentioned how now you have new memoirs of queer, different types of family structure that are exposed. What do you see the next step in terms of this corpus of potential literature or portrayal or representation? So on one hand, the transformation in the last 10, 20 years, and what can we anticipate in terms of the representation?
Yeah, I'll start. I'm going to also, if you don't mind, I'll take it back also to the last question and connect them a little bit, because there's something I wanted to chime in about there. So one piece of this relationship between the Haredi world and the secular American culture is also these points of contact naturally. So you see it in memoirs, you see it in the media, when the stories reach the media, you see it when cases reach the secular courts. You have these forced interactions between these two worlds and using the tools of the state to negotiate problems in the community, or using the tools of the media to highlight problems in the community or outside of it. And so you end up having this discourse between the two, which is really taking us to your question right here. So I think it also goes back to something that you had brought up a little earlier about, like, something that's really interesting to me is about how this discourse also shapes identities and shapes the people engaged in this discourse. So you have the discourse internally of the Haredi community, the things they tell themselves, the things they print in Mishpacha magazine and places like that, and the changing portrayal of Exeters that's influenced in part by the media and the things that Exeters are saying on the outside. There's a lot, when people are talking on the outside, that influences the inside too. They don't want to look bad for the outside world, and it kind of brings a reckoning on the inside as well. And then you even have discourse like the kind that we're having right here, this kind of meta-discourse of how do we understand all these kinds of discourses, and how does that shape our understanding of insiders and exiters, and that reaches inside also and outside. I feel like this forum is probably reaching outsiders more than insiders, but it also shapes the way outside, the people who leave the Haredi community look at themselves when you have this kind of meta-discourse happening. So I think this is all part of this larger narrative, but also identity shaping process that's taking place through the give and take.
Not yet, but we're going to get to you. Maybe in a few minutes, we'll shift. Yeah, but to address your question, Jessica already noted that so many of the authors of the recent ex-Orthodox memoirs are women, and I would say actually the vast majority of them. That there's literally. It's a relatively small literature, so I don't want to, overemphasize just how significant it is that there's only two people who now identify as male, who are approximately two, who are who have written these memoirs. But basically, the overriding majority are women, and I think it's interesting. And I actually spoke to Naomi Seidman about this issue a lot. And one thing that she argued connected to this issue of the secular triumphalism and how these memoirs could feed into a kind of secular narrative against the religion in general and the ultra-Orthodox community in particular. If you think of the ultra-Orthodox community as fundamentally, backwards and problematic, and you look at the people who leave those communities as escapees, people who are managing to escape from this horrible condition, in the sort of secular imagination, who are the most vulnerable population, you could say, oh, these are women. So if you find women who are writing these narratives, it could be seen as the kind of perfect victim to epitomize this horrible condition that they went through. This is not really my theory so much as Naomi's, but I think it is definitely worth thinking about why so many of these narratives are written by women. I think it's interesting, even though, again, we're talking about 12, 14 books in total. I think it's an interesting thing. To go to your second point about where things are headed, obviously it's always hard to say for sure, but I think it is interesting that the most recent ex-Orthodox memoir that I'm aware of is Kissing Girls on Shabbat from Sarah Glass. and that book is about her sort of queer identity and coming to terms with that, but also related to sexual trauma. And she's, I think, a psychologist, and she talks about her therapy practice and helping others come to terms with the traumas that they experienced in the ultra-Orthodox community related to their sexual identity. And I found out recently that Chani Getter, who was on one of the panels yesterday, and she's also coming out with a book that's also related to sexual trauma and healing. And I wonder if this is one of the directions that we might see going forward, not just OTDs or ex-Orthodox people who became therapists or psychologists or deal in a sort of therapeutic way to help the formerly Orthodox, but also people who kind of took their ex-Orthodox experience and then related in some way to helping other people in society. And if this might be one of the sort of new trends going forward.
Thanks. So I would make the case that it's a much larger body of literature than you're making, and I think that's because I define the literature differently. It's really representation, so looking at like every form of representation. Print memoir is probably the most traditional, but thinking about film and online literature and journalistic and, all sorts of different forms. And I think you have a really robust literature. Looking forward, I think that we can expect that body to grow, that body of literature and representation to grow. I think we can expect more men to be writing about it. More people documenting narratives that in some ways are more nuanced and different. And I think one of the trends that I've seen recently, and even here at the conference, which I really appreciate, is it came up in the panel I moderated yesterday about the authenticity piece. And it came up in discussion with the Netflix series Unorthodox that I read a number of reviews of Unorthodox, that series that was really popular towards the beginning of the pandemic. There were reviews by people who identified as OTD who were critical of Unorthodox for not elevating the joyful component of Haredi life, that it was such a dreary portrayal of the Haredi community. And it shouldn't, and then that was inauthentic. And I think we're gonna start moving away from some of the more extreme stances. I think this is actually a fairly, standard practice in normalization, and just starting to appreciate the richness of what Haredi and Yeshivish and Orthodox communities offer, what they repress, what they don't offer, what they steal from people, but just understanding that it's a very complex mosaic. That's part of the reckoning of the journey out. So I think that's what I'm looking forward to.
Yeah. I'm just going to add something because this is something that actually in the last chapter of my book, it's called The Public Artist, and part of the potential transformation and exactly as you said, the critical voice from inside and trying to transform the narrative, and especially in this representation on big screen. The idea of when you look at cinema of minorities, you always have the voices. Today you can't have a play without the voices of a minority, right? Speaking out, and it's not enough if you're writing about Rwanda to just have black person. You need to have some internal, somebody who's connected to the culture. So I think expanding on the representation of Jewishness, this is the same thing. Today it's not enough to say you're Jewish. You need to have also a connection to the Hasidic world if you want to portray it. And the role of OTD artists, and we've seen a lot of them on stage, and maybe writing script, but to really be at the production and I would say behind the camera, to really have the power to not only being collaborator, but to be the main character, to write script and to be able to be there. And that's potentially maybe what we can imagine in the future, and also kind of more, as you said, collaboration with people inside and those nuances. And this is a little bit what the women I mean, my last chapter is a lot about Melissa Wells and Malky Goldman as well, and I take them as case studies because I follow them closely, and it's very interesting to see their role of, wanting to transform the industry itself. And then I'm going to open.
Can I go back just quickly to some?
Yes.
To actually what
and then we'll open the floor to the audience.
I just want to build on what you both were saying. So Jessica expanded from just thinking about the memoir literature to film, and you can even argue activism as well as a kind of a way of using your voice, and activism often makes it to the media. And Zalman had talked about how a lot of these portrayals, you were talking specifically about memoir, but you can expand it, are specifically women's voices, and how he was arguing that it's the consumer, the American consumer, that's pulling these voices out and giving them ear. But something else that you'll notice if you look through this literature is not just that they're disproportionately women. If you look at the memoir literature and the film literature and even the activists across this landscape, they're disproportionately divorcees. They're disproportionately divorced. And now there's a growing movement also toward LGBT. So why are these the voices we're hearing the most? And a big part of this has to do with stigmatization. And there's a whole literature on the relationship between stigma and the way stigma categories, people who are severely stigmatized end up forming sub-communities amongst themselves. In the literature, it's sometimes called oppositional sub-communities that are very vocal. And there's a whole explanation to why they're vocal. In part, it's to validate themselves, to validate their new identity. They find validation in giving voice to who they are and in giving voice to what's wrong with what they left behind. So it makes a lot of sense that the loudest voices are the ones that are the most stigmatized and most marginalized within the Haredi world. And those are the ones we're hearing the most. At a conference a couple years ago, Zalman was actually talking about the distinction between the literature you hear about and his own research. Do you remember that presentation? And he was saying that there's this great discrepancy between what you see in the media, the louder voices, and then what he found in his own research, where most of the experiences were not so extreme and not so devastating as the ones you see. And a lot of this has to do with the self-selection of the people who are going to be speaking up. It's these severely stigmatized people, and those are the stories that we're hearing the loudest.
Sorry, if I could just say one thing. Yes, it's very good of you to remember that discussion. But part of what I was saying there is that it's also, I grant everything that you said. I think that's all true. It's also true that when we think about the most sort of extreme cases in the ex-Orthodox literature, the memoirs and so on, and other forms of literature, which I think are, of course, equally worth studying and thinking about, it's also true that those are sort of the most sensationalist stories. So it's not surprising that the media is either picking up those stories or promoting those stories because sensation, gets people's attention. So I think there's multiple dynamics at work here.
Great. So now we're opening the floor for questions. I'm going to start here. And please, more questions than comments would be really appreciated and short and sweet. Thank you so much.
A few years ago, there was a tragic story of a young woman who committed suicide. I was wondering, has that had an immediate impact with the community, Haredi community, but has there been any long-term impact? Second question, mothers and fathers of OTD children, are any of them able to support their children and ease them from the community and maintain relationships?
So who wants to jump on this?
I can take the suicide. So I think these suicide stories do have a big impact, both in the community of people who leave and among the people who stay. And you see this in the gatherings that form. There was also a lot of media attention around suicide. And media attention drives change because people don't like when you're telling bad stories about them. So it motivates people to change, to behave differently. There was a suicide in a Hasidic community, in the Belz community, that motivated what, I think, was it Zalman or Jessica? One of you had brought up that one Hasidic community had actually, it was Zalman actually, had organized a whole movement to incorporate the people who leave, and that was in response to a suicide in their community. There was in response, it might be the one that you're thinking of, but there was a lot of media attention after one suicide. And in one of the articles I was reading, and talked about this activist who came to one of these memorial ceremonies. It was led by Exeters, but the activist was actually religious, and he was like making commitments. I want to help promote change on the inside. So there's a lot of discourse. There was a suicide in Israel. Also, it was another divorced mother that said she was from the ex-Hasidic community where they have really restrictive sexual practices. And the articles that came out about those practices just blew up all over in the US and abroad and in Israel in the media that shined a light on those issues. So suicide shines a light on issues because there's a lot of people that speak out when something that harrowing happens, and I do believe it's driving change as well. And you see it in these different little ways. It also drives connections in a surprising way, like with the Bells Initiative, with these memorial groups that are bringing people outside and inside together. So, sometimes you see that happening as well.
We go back. Okay, no more battery. Can you hear me?
Oh, okay. One question at a time, and then if we have time, we go back to your second question. Yes, and then I see, please.
Yes, two questions.
Oh, one question per person, I'm sorry.
Please explain to me, when somebody leaves, all right, you claim that, the person can declare that they are Orthodox. How do they find out the woman is leaving and she's Orthodox? If they find out she's not Orthodox, do they take the children? And also part of that is that if a woman leaves and she's not Orthodox or she's come out as gay, is the court more favorable to the father and the community as far as the children are concerned? What happens with the children?
Sorry, I'm going to take this one as well because it's a divorce question. So you're saying when a woman leaves, how do you know if she's Orthodox or not in those cases? So it gets litigated sometimes, but another piece that comes up is this is a question. Sometimes a couple will get divorced and one spouse will use as a strategy to gain custody allegations against the religiosity of the other partner. So the mother or the father might be fully religious, and one partner will start making allegations that the other partner is not. This came up in a bunch of cases that I was studying, as a ploy to gain custody because they know Batei Din, the religious courts, will be more favorable to the religious parent, and even secular courts in some cases, in the interest of preserving status quo, will be more favorable to the religious parent sometimes. So it's not consistent, not across the board, but sometimes that's used actually as a strategy. And then sometimes that strategy actually works so effectively that the person who was labeled irreligious down the line is so shunned and marginalized because of that label that they ultimately really leave. So that was something that I saw in a bunch of cases. Yeah, so sometimes one partner, they're getting divorced, will start spreading rumors in the community or in the court that their spouse is not religious. And they'll use that as a way to get custody because they think that the community will rally around them if they think that they're the religious spouse and the other one is not. Or they think the Beis Din will support them, the religious court, if they think that this parent is the religious one and the other one is not. Or they even think that in secular court, they'll have more support in maintaining status quo if they can convince the court that they're religious and the other spouse is not. So sometimes sometimes this label is used against the person who's still religious as a ploy, as a strategy for the other parent to get custody. And sometimes this label is so effective that even if the parent was religious at the outset when she got divorced, because she's now marginalized, there are rumors about her in her community, people don't trust her, people are, supporting her husband, she has no support in the divorce anymore because of this. Down the line, in some of these cases, the person completely left the religion, and you can argue that that was a tipping point or a starting point in that process.
Okay, so stop. I'm just going to take one question here, and I'm going to go in the back. Thank you. I see here, but I want to,
Can you hear me?
And please, one question.
So, I'll give you one. So, I'm curious about the messianic doctrine in the Lubavitch community, that Schneerson is returning as the Messiah. And this is a relatively new doctrine. Is that universally accepted in the Lubavitch community? And if not, is it considered deviancy?
Considered deviant by whom? By the All right. So this is a good question. Very briefly, for numerous years before Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the last Lubavitcher Rebbe, before he passed away in 1994, pretty much all Lubavitchers, by and large, believed that he was the Messiah. After he passed away, then there was sort of shifts where some parts of the community felt were labeled anti-messianists, anti-Mashiachists, and some were labeled Mashiachists or Messianists. But it's very complicated in terms of what the actual attitudes of the Lubavitchers are, because some people argue, and I think there's a lot of justice with this argument, a lot of validity to it, that many Lubavitchers across this supposed line actually believe in their heart of hearts that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is still the Messiah, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, and he will come back and be the Messiah. It's just that they think that it's bad for publicity to say that, because just people think it sounds weird, but also some people think it sounds very much like the Christian belief in the return of Jesus. So it's hard to pin down exactly what they believe in. As Miriam has been noting, that there's a lot of complicated relationships between the inside of these ultra-Orthodox communities and how they're represented to the outside world, and how news stories about them, let's say, influence people on the inside. And Lubavitch in particular is very media savvy, and they're very aware of what the popular media is saying about them and how it might impact other people's attitudes towards them. And since Lubavitch is interested in Jewish outreach and in being connected to non-Orthodox Jews all around the world, they're especially concerned about their popular image. So it's a little hard to know exactly what all the Lubavitchers believe, but definitely there are some Lubavitchers today that still believe that the Rebbe is the Messiah or will be the Messiah.
Okay, and is there any, yes, one, and I'm sorry if I don't take all the questions. I try my best, but the hands are coming at the same time.
So my question is about, you were talking more about the gray area that has sort of grown in the community for people who were previously considered deviants, and now sort of there's space being made for them in the community. I'm curious about not just the space that's made for them, but the sort of public space that's made for them, so sort of institutions. So what I'm noting from the community, that there aren't really schools for people like that, but there are minyanim, there are shuls, maybe people are speaking publicly on podcasts, but I'm curious about whether there are more institutions, or there may be in the future, 5 years down the line, there might be schools for people like that. And I'm particularly also interested in, because I see where a lot of that gray space is sort of an age range of people who they're out of the system, they've finished school, but they're not getting married, and so they're kind of out of the pipeline. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of people in their late 20s, early 30s, and so there's this whole, the gray space tends to be of that demographic. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts or comments on that. Or institutions, the question is more do you see any institutions that are being built or that will be built for that sort of gray space?
There are some institutions like that. You're right, there's probably not enough, but it seems like there's a recognition that there's a need. So there are organizations that help. There are some specifically for girls, teens, who are going off, that kind of catch them and give them, I don't remember the name of it, Something Place or Something Home. Our Place, yeah, there are a couple like that, some for girls, some for boys. There's also, there are yeshivas that are more moderate that try to catch those students and to reinstill the love of learning, but in a more moderate way, not as intense for the ones who are feeling alienated by the learning culture. So it seems like there's a recognition for this need and a growing movement to fill them, but not yet. I don't think it's fully there yet, which is why it's a question you can raise now, or not as visible enough yet. So it seems like the community is recognizing the need and moving to fill that need. And I guess we'll see over the next decade how it takes off or not.
If I could just add to that, though, again, I think we need to be very careful about what exactly we're talking about. So I remember like 20 years ago, I finished yeshiva. I didn't have a high school diploma. I wanted to get a GED, and I ended up taking a GED like prep course that was offered through the city of New York, but it was hosted by an Orthodox organization or program that was for quote unquote at-risk youth. Now, at that point, the only thing I was really at risk of was going to college. But you know, this program was designed for these troubled teens, and it was very interesting. Like the physical space, we were in some kind of bunker-like structure, under subterranean structure, and they were like spray painted on the walls. Like it was supposed to be, I don't know, this sort of cool type of thing. There was a pool table or whatever, but clearly the intent of the program was to save these troubled youth and get them back to be Orthodox. They weren't making a space for ex-Orthodox. They were trying to get ex-Orthodox people to become Orthodox. So I'm not saying that there are no programs that have, let's say, I don't know, more benevolent or open-minded motivation. But I think we need to be very clear when we're talking about the Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox community, when they're making programs, when they're designing programs, are they designing them in order to recapture or reconnect with their members or former members, in order to get them to do kiruv, to do outreach on them, to persuade them to come back to the community? Or are they creating spaces that are truly open and accepting of people wherever they are and wherever they, you know, plan on going in the future?
Yeah, and without necessarily presenting them as at risk.
And I think he's hit on a real need, actually, if you think about this, that you have different motivations inside the community, different motivations of organizations outside for Exeters who leave the community, and there's this growing fluidity and identity of the people who like kind of leave but kind of stay, and we do need new spaces that can embrace both sides of that identity.
Okay, I see a lot of hands, but we have to close. I'm really sorry, but you have the chance maybe to discuss now that the panel is over. Thank you so much for this wonderful panelists, and it was great. And now there's a break, if I'm not wrong. 15 minutes. Okay.
Yep, so now we're going to have a 15-minute break. We'll be back at 11:45 for our next panel.
Check, 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 check 1 2, 1 2. Check 1 2, 1 2.
Hello, everyone. We're going to get started with our final panel of the conference. If we can all take our seats. All right. All right, welcome, everyone. We are going to begin with session 2 on going back to where you came from. Thank you. So Naomi Seidman is unfortunately not joining us today. She's not feeling well. So we're going to start with Shaul Magid, who is going to present on Is Heresy an Operative Category Anymore? Judaism After Orthodoxy. Read his bio. Shaul Magid teaches modern Judaism at Harvard Divinity School and is senior research fellow at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard. He is the author of many books and essays, including Hasidism on the Margin and The Necessity of Exile, Essays from a Distance. He also works as a renewal rabbi, bringing Hasidic energy to post-traditional spaces. I'll welcome Shaul to the stage.
Thank you, and thank you all for staying to the bitter end, as they say. I want to try to, I don't have a paper to read. I want to read a couple of sections of a variety of different things that I've written on the subject. And what I wanted to do is to try to explore one segment of, I think, what this conference was dealing with, which is in what way can Haredi Judaism, ultra-Orthodoxy, however you want to call it, contribute to the reconstruction, recalibration of Judaism in America today. I want to be specific about America because I think it presents a particular kinds of challenges. And I want to do it on around two questions. The first question is the category of heresy, and the second is the category of Avera Lishma, or sin for the sake of heaven, which, as we know, is a rabbinic category that's used and deployed in various ways. And I want to try to think about using it creatively as a way of thinking about moving us further into the 21st century. So the phenomenon of OTD leaving traditional Judaism long before Orthodoxy was even a thing, because as we know, of course, we didn't really talk about the history of Orthodoxy. Orthodoxy itself is really a response to religious reform. It's not that Orthodoxy comes first and reform comes second. It's the opposite. It's Orthodoxy comes to respond to the liberalization of Judaism in Europe in the middle of the 19th century. And very often the idea of leaving kind of conventional notions of Jewish life is this concept of heresy. Now, heresy itself is a Christian term. It doesn't really have an exact corollary. There are a number of different terms, apikorsis, minut. There are various terms within the rabbinic corpus that refer to those who choose to move either outside of religious practice or religious belief. And this was a way of, in a certain sense, drawing boundaries. Heresiology is really an entire Christian enterprise in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, which tries to draw boundaries. That's really what heresy is about. It's about drawing and policing boundaries. And one of the questions that's raised specifically by a sociologist from Boston University, Peter Berger, in his book called The Heretical Imperative, makes the claim that the term itself, the Greek term heresy itself, means choice. And his argument is basically that modernity presents us with what he calls a pluralization of possibility structures, or elsewhere calls a heretical imperative. That is, part of modernity is about choice. And therefore, everyone that lives in the modern world is presented with a series of choices of where to live, how to live, in what community to live in. And that's true of ultra-Orthodox Jews as well as secular Jews. Everybody is making that choice. Now, obviously, social constraints place a certain kind of emphasis on what the price of that choice is, and that's some of what we've heard about in the conference. But I just want to read one line from Berger that I think encapsulates it, and he writes, "For modern man, or for the modern person, heresy typically becomes a necessity, an imperative, because modernity, and I'm quoting Berger here, modernity creates a new situation in which picking and choosing becomes an imperative." Now, if we say that Berger is essentially correct, it will, in a way, erase the possibility of heresy the way it's traditionally understood. If only to say that all of us are heretics, because all of us choose, and all of us live in a world of choice. Even if we're raised in a community that claims that there is no choice, that claim is a false claim. As everyone from Footsteps knows, as everyone who is OTD knows. Now again, the choice can come, there can be a very high price for that choice, but the choice nonetheless exists. In Judaism, traditionally, heresy was in a pre-modernity, a complicated category, and it was usually policed through excommunication. Now, excommunication is a much more operative category within Christianity and functioned in Christianity in a fundamental way because there was, certainly before the 16th century and the rise of Protestantism, there was church authority. So if you were excommunicated from the church, you were excommunicated from the church globally. But Judaism never had that. And so its use of excommunication was largely local or regional. And I'll give you a few examples. I mean, the classic example is Spinoza, right? Spinoza was excommunicated from his community in Amsterdam for espousing views against the authority of the Bible and certain practices. Now, usually, in the case of someone like Uriel da Costa, who's also from the Amsterdam community, and there's a reason why the Amsterdam Jews excommunicated more frequently than other Jewish communities, is that in Judaism, excommunication was used primarily as deterrence. In other words, you were excommunicated, but the assumption was that the excommunication would get you to do tshuva. Spinoza's case is an interesting one because Spinoza's writ of excommunication, for those of you who have seen it, it's a very short one-page document, basically is not inviting him to come back or to do tshuva. And the interesting thing about Spinoza, as opposed to many other Jews who are excommunicated, is that he never really attempts to go back. He never wants to go back. That's the first thing that's interesting about Spinoza. The second thing that's interesting about Spinoza is that he doesn't convert to Christianity, which is what many Jews who were excommunicated did. So in a sense, Spinoza is seen to be, ironically, the first modern Jew who is excommunicated from the community and doesn't convert to another religion and creates a kind of inchoate notion of a Jewish secular space. Even though Spinoza spends the rest of his life writing about Judaism. The Theological Political Treatise is all about Judaism. It's all about the Bible. He writes a grammar of the Hebrew language. There are two other cases that I want to mention. One is the excommunication of Mordechai Kaplan in the 1920s, after he published, 1940s, I'm sorry, after he published a Siddur, which, among other things, took out any mention of resurrection, and the excommunication of Rav Kook in the 1920s in Jerusalem by the old settlement Jews of Jerusalem who burned Kook's books in public, excommunicating him because he was collaborating with the Zionists. Obviously, neither of those cases took root. Right? Mordechai Kaplan remained a Jew in good standing in American Judaism, and of course, Rav Kook remained a Jew in good standing and became the chief rabbi of Mandate Palestine. So this, in a certain sense, is the way in which excommunication doesn't really function. I want to make one more distinction before I kind of try to pivot to Avera Lishma. There's a difference between the heretic and the apostate. And the difference is that the heretic espouses views that are non-normative or unconventional, but uses them very often to reconstruct a new form of Judaism out of that non-normativity. The apostate converts to another religion. The apostate leaves completely. The apostate doesn't threaten Jews. The apostate kind of moves on, except in one case, which I'll mention in a moment. But the apostate basically is not a threat to Judaism, because the apostate doesn't really claim to say anything new about Judaism. The heretic, what's dangerous about the heretic is not the non-normative views that he or she takes. What's dangerous about the heretic is the way in which they then try to reconstruct, recalibrate, reformulate Judaism in light of those heretical views. And in a certain sense, that becomes what is of interest to me as a scholar, not really that interested in the apostate. I'm really interested in the heretic and the role that the heretic plays. And what does that actually mean to engage in a project of heresy as a constructive Jewish project at a time when heresy no longer maintains any kind of label of erasure or exclusion, and that the Jewish community really has no operative way to police that heresy. So if you're excommunicated from a synagogue, you just can go around the block to another synagogue. Right? And that was true with Spinoza too. Spinoza could have gone to Italy, and he could have gone to a synagogue in Italy, and he would have been able to become part of that community. It was only in the community of Amsterdam because the rabbis were regionally limited in terms of their ability to engage in that project. So I want to take that, and then I want to talk a moment about Avera Lishma. Because I think Avera Lishma may be one tool, ideational tool to use to think about the reconstruction of Judaism from a heretical imperative, from those people who leave the normative Jewish world in which they were raised. Now, one could also just ask the question, and I don't really have an answer to this, but one could certainly ask the question, if there's no heresy, is there normativity? Is there a normative Jewish community? Orthodoxy likes to think so by making the claim of normativity through the claim of authenticity, but that's only a self-affirmed claim that is not really agreed upon by most Jews. If we want to think of what is normative Judaism for most Jews, if we're speaking fully within the category of numbers, it's Reform Judaism. Because most Jews, Reform Judaism is the largest Jewish denomination in America. Only 10% of American Jews identify as being Orthodox. So it's kind of strange to make the claim of normativity when you make up 10% of the population. But that's the claim that's made. And everyone is perfectly, everyone can make any kind of claim they want. I mean, I guess that's the heretical imperative that we live in. So there's a category that is developed by Mordechai Kaplan, speaking of a modern-day 20th century heretic, that was called by Jack Cohn, his son-in-law, or Ira Eisenstadt, I think, originally, post-halacha. Now, post-halacha is basically a way of responding to Reform Judaism that by and large constructs Judaism outside of the obligatory nature of Jewish law through what became known in Germany and later in America as ethical monotheism. And much of Reform is really a product of this ethical monotheism, going back to the prophetic tradition, that Jewish law was really a product of the times and has been outdated, and so on and so on. So Kaplan comes up and basically offers a sociological approach, influenced by Emil Durkheim and others, to say that, no, I actually think that ceremonies, acts, behaviors, rituals are integral to how a society identifies itself as different from societies around it. And so he basically develops this notion of folkways, halacha as folkways. That is, Jews do Jewish things together as Jews, and that's what makes a Jewish community. The difference between halacha and post-halacha for Kaplan is that post-halacha does not have an obligatory, it's not based on an obligatory category. One does not do what one does Jewishly because they are obligated by God to do it, because Kaplan didn't believe in a personal God. One does what one does Jewishly because that participates in Jewish life, the continuity of Jewish life. So I want to take that and I want to take it one step further and offer another model of post-halacha that I'm calling Avera Lishma, or sin for the sake of heaven, as a heretical act done for the sake of heaven. Now we know that Avera Lishma is a category within rabbinic literature in very particular kinds of cases where, for example, the famous passage in the Talmud that the breaking the law is the law's fulfillment. And the phrase breaking the law is the law's fulfillment usually revolves around the notion of pikuach nefesh, or to save a life. So if you're in a situation where somebody's life is in danger and you have to, desecrate the Sabbath in order to save their life, saving their life and desecrating the Sabbath is keeping the Sabbath. And if you choose to keep the Sabbath and not save the person's life, the Talmud calls you a chassid shoteh, a foolish, pious person. Right? So there is this category of Avera Lishma, but Avera Lishma within the rabbinic corpus functions within the orbit of halachic discourse. And so I became interested in exploring Jewish law in the writings of Zalman Schachter Shalomi. He was not a Jewish renewal rabbi, the rabbi who constructed Jewish renewal. And he wants to basically offer a model, or my understanding of his understanding of Jewish law is making a model of Avera Lishma. And the Avera Lishma starts from a basic principle that halacha, as traditionally understood, and again, this is more complicated for the sake of time, I don't really have the ability to explore this at length, is really largely about two things. Avodas Hashem, serving God, answering to a divine call, and separating from the Gentiles. Right? The dietary laws are one example, but there are many other categories of law that are really about separating from the Gentile, creating a certain kind of particularistic view. So, Schachter Shalomi, coming from Kaplan, and there's a real influence of Schachter Shalomi from Kaplan, how do you incorporate operationally the universalistic principles that are built into prophetic Judaism within the particularistic nature of halacha? And this becomes one way in which Avera Lishma functions. So the approach to Jewish practice is both humanistic and universalistic, as we know. But the way that the Avera Lishma of Schachter Shalomi is that halacha should no longer separate the Jew from the non-Jew, or the Jew from the world, but to create a planetary Judaism founded on the intense particularity of mitzvot turned outward toward the world and not inward away from the world. That notion of turning outward toward the world is an instantiation of Avera Lishma. If we understand that halacha is functions to protect the Jew from the world, then using halacha as a tool to reach out to the world would itself be crossing boundaries. It would be a heretical move. It would be a case of Avera Lishma. I want to read something very quickly to try to get at this. There's this notion that functions within Jewish pietistic literature that Isidore Tversky, who for many years was a professor of Jewish studies at Harvard, called meta halakha. That somehow within the Orthodox framework, I'm going to read a quote from him. Somehow within the Orthodox framework, he writes as follows: the tension in halakha flows from the painful awareness that manifestation and essence sometimes drift apart, from the sober recognition that a carefully constructed, finely chiseled normative system cannot regularly reflect, refract, or energize interior, fluid, spiritual forces and motives. That as much as Orthodoxy views halakha as the sine qua non of Judaism, Tversky, as an Orthodox Jew, is acknowledging that there are times when Jews need to act in other ways. Now, he's not talking about acting outside of halakha. He's talking about acting more deeply inside of halakha. But what I'm in a certain sense offering a heretical reading of his passage is to say that the moving inside of halakha as a meta-halachic impulse can also be moving outside of halakha as an Avera Lishma impulse. That somehow the structures itself need to break down in order for the Jews to be able to fulfill what needs to be fulfilled. This happens in many cases. I mean, the classic case that many of us know about is Rev Kook's Zionism. That the secular Jews who settled Israel, and I'll give you another example actually from Yisachar Tachtal, writing from Hungary in 1944 in an attic where he was eventually captured and killed, where he writes, and this is a Hungarian ultra-Orthodox Jew, even if the builders of the land in Israel in our days are committing sins, this is his words, and deliberately defying the will of God, and not keeping the commandments, still God welcomes their actions of building the land with love and great affection. Months before he was captured by the Nazis and killed. Right. Rev Kook makes similar assertions. So we already have a case where you can see that for Tachtal and for Kook, Zionism is Avera Lishma from their perspective. They can't say that it's not transgressive, but they also can't say that it's against the will of God. And I think this is what Schachter Shalomi really tries to develop in trying to understand what a Jewish renewal, what a post-halachic Jewish renewal life would be. And what I want to suggest in the context of this conference is that I think that this is part of what the OTD world can offer Judaism. It can offer it a constructive, pietistic notion of Avera Lishma. By owning the heresy, because the heresy is an imperative anyway, so it doesn't matter, right? We're all heretics, right? By owning the heresy and also arguing that Judaism itself is not being transgressed by the abrogation of the normative, but is being fulfilled by the transgression of the normative in order to create a new model of Jewish life. I think that's one way of capturing what Renewal is about. So here's an interesting thing, guys. I want to end in just a few minutes. And this is the counterintuitive claim that he's making. Much of Judaism after the Holocaust was an attempt to rebuild, reconstruct, revive, create models of Jewish continuity and survival in light of the Nazi genocide. In a certain sense, Judaism closing the circle around itself in a variety of different ways in order to protect itself from the war against Jews in Europe. And Schechter Shalomi has a whole different view of the Holocaust. For him, the Holocaust was a sign that the Jews have to become more outward toward the world, more expansive, more embracing, that Judaism has to become a world religion and not a religion only for Jews. Now, he doesn't mean this to say that, everyone should practice Judaism. I mean, that's something that Mayor Stephen Wise, the founder of Reform Judaism, really argued that in a discussion about Reform Judaism joining together with Unitarianism, which was actually a real option in the 19th century. There was going to be a merger of the Unitarian Church and Reform Judaism. In a sermon, Wise says that he thinks that eventually American Christians will just become Reform Jews. He actually says this because he felt like everything that is true about Christianity in the Unitarian sense is Jewish, and everything that's false about Christianity is not Jewish, right? Now, it didn't exactly happen that way, and this is not something that I think that that Schechter Shalomi is arguing, but he's basically making the claim. This is the heretical claim that there's a Jewish vision that presents an unhalachic idea that Jewish normative practice should be a way of softening barriers between spiritual, ethnic, and national identities rather than building them up. The goal here is to foster more global consciousness that is founded on diversity but allows for permeable boundaries. How can Jews become part of the world, not in a sociological way? How can Judaism become part of the world? And I think that's something that many people who come from inside the highly normative claims of authenticity and exit that world, they actually have the tools to be able to think about the heretical imperative in a constructive way to rebuild a Judaism after the Holocaust that is about embracing the world rather than protecting itself from it. Because I think we're in a moment of time today, September 2024, given everything that's going on in Israel, given everything that's going on college campuses, where the inclination seems to be the opposite. We seem to be moving into this protective mode, whether it's defending the war in Gaza, whether it's anti-Semitism in America, as opposed to basically saying, we as Jews carry a wisdom of 3,000 years. We want to offer it to the world as a way of taking part, being a part of a more humanistic vision of reality. And I just want to end with this final thing. Schechter Shalomi once wrote that the thing that was probably the most radical image that he ever witnessed that changed his entire understanding of what it meant to be a human being and what it meant to be a Jew was the iconic picture of the Earth from the moon landing. We all know that picture, right, of the kind of this beautiful blue ball floating in the sky. Because I think when he saw that image, he recognized that we all share this one space, this one very delicate, fragile space. And all of the different particularities that human beings have developed over the course of human civilization, if they can't contribute to the survival of that beautiful ball hanging in the sky, then they're really not worth anything. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Shaul. So now we're going to go to our next panelist, Roni Maisel, who will be presenting on reading after Orthodoxy. Roni is assistant professor of comparative literature at UC Berkeley, working on Hebrew and Yiddish literatures and queer and post-colonial theory. Maisel is completing a book manuscript titled Bad Readers, Misreading, Mistranslation, and Other Textual Malpractices in Yiddish and Hebrew. Maisel turns her own OTD experience to theoretical advantage by arguing for the power, pleasure, and efficacy of OTD reading as a productive form of bad reading. Now I will welcome Roni to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Well, Nomi's not here, but thank you to Zalman and to all the folks at YIVO and everyone who's doing everything to make this happen. This is amazing. Okay, so I'll jump right in, and I say that I want to introduce you to my recently discovered hero, Moshe Aaron Lev. I don't have a photo of him, nor do I know much about him at all, but I do gather he was a passionate reader. He cared deeply about texts, about the truth, about the world, and he cared a lot when it came to the Russian Tsardom, and especially Tsar Nikolai II, whom he called the pig. And we'll get back to the pig. I encountered Moshe Aaron through a series of Yiddish inscriptions he left in a library book. That's a library book, signing his name on the inner cover. This book was read by Moshe Aaron Lev from Krinki, Grodno Gubernia, Grodno province, now living here in Cricklewood, London. What is it? Diesen Buch hat gelesen Moshe Aaron Lev, etc., etc. So I found these inscriptions in a copy of Sefer Shevet Yehuda Shalem, the Complete Scepter of Judah, printed in 1904 by the Vilna Press, the widow and brother Rum, or the famous printers of Shas Vilna. And this volume is now held in the collections of the National Library in Jerusalem, though when Moshe Aaron read it, it was held in the collections, it belonged to a Jewish lending library in London's East End, the heart of London's Jewish working class at the time, in the early 20th century. That book is a patchwork of Yiddish translations and significant additions to, as well as omissions from, the 16th century Hebrew historiographical work, Sefer Shevet Yehuda. One of the additions was a Yiddish translation, or more accurately, actually an adaptation of another work entirely, the 17th century Hebrew chronicle, Yeven Metzula, or Abyss of Despair, which narrates the tragic events known in Hebrew and Yiddish as Gzeres Tachtat, or the Khmelnytsky Cossack uprising in Ukraine. And it is this part of the book, the Gzeres Tachtat part, that Moshe Aaron Lev cared most about, read most thoroughly, and vandalized most passionately. And I'll show you a few examples. But Moshe Aaron's multiple inscriptions, which included swears and violent threats, as well as a sense of shared intimacy with other readers of that same library copy, informs my exploration today with you of the pleasures, catastrophes, ruptures, and potentials of what I think of as reading after Orthodoxy, or bad reading, which is the topic of the book that I'm writing. So this version of Yeven Metzula, quite like the book as a whole, is a heavy adaptation of the original work that tries to instill in its reader, the adaptation that is, tries to instill in its readers a sense of loyalty to the Russian Empire. It's a weird project. I won't get into it, why at this odd moment at the turn of the 20th century he decides to make Jews like the Tsars. It's odd. But in response, at multiple points, Moshe Aaron either strikes through the text or adds comments on the margins. So I have here some examples. But this is the example of one page that made him particularly angry. where the editor blesses the Russian monarchy and praises Russian Jews' loyalty to the crown, Moshe Allen began crisscrossing the entire page with his pencil. That's on the right-hand side. But on the opposite page, next to a mention of Tsar Nikolai II, Moshe Allen wrote passionately, Jemach Shmoi v'zechoi aufgerissen werden, es soll von das Land Russland kein Zecher bleiben nicht, or may his name be blotted out, may it be torn apart, may there remain no trace of that country, Russia. Moshe Allen then, yes, we'll get into our contemporary feelings about that land, Russia. But then he addressed future readers of the volume, and this is at the bottom on the left-hand side. And this is, I remind you, a library book, right? So he addresses readers of that same volume, writing, Les nicht den falschen Buch, verbrennt es. Do not read this erroneous book, burn it. However, rather than burning it, he ended up returning the book to the library, obviously. This is how I got it. But before doing so, however, he became a little more creative, and on another page where the editor comments again about Jews' loyalty to Russia, he struck through the word Russia or Russland and wrote in England instead, because he was living in London, and feeling a sense of loyalty to his newfound home. And finally, where the text relates to the Kaiser, that is to the Tsar, Emperor Nikolai II, Moshe Allen changes the letters Kof and Yod to a Chet and added an ayin instead, thus spelling out, or in fact misspelling the word Chazer, that is pig or swine, to describe the Kaiser, Chazer, Yirem Hoidoi, or may his majesty be exalted. All right, so surely Yiddish speakers had much juicier swears for the Russian Tsars than Chazel, and I do invite you to develop your own new ones, and in particular for a certain very contemporary Russian leader, as well as all of his authoritarian warmongering friends. But my question is, if and how Moshe Allen's acts of vandalism could be helpful for us analytically. And there are a few things that I would like to explore, to consider in this story with you. So the first is I would like to think about his form of vandalism as an act of defiance, attacking the book not only as a material object, but as a social institution, criticizing choices made by the book's creator and breaking the rules of the London East End lending library in that process. And so this is the bylaws of the library that are attached just on the other side of where Moshe Allen writes his name. And of course, the bylaws prohibit vandalism of books. And there's a nice paragraph about what to do if you get an infectious disease and you happen to have a library book at home, what you should do with it. And I just included it in the slides so you can enjoy it. And I'll soon talk more about what I mean by the book as a social institution. But second, right, so thinking about it as an act of defiance. But second, I'm interested in Moshe Allen's fascination with the texts about the catastrophe, texts that rely on graphic and gruesome depictions of brutality and horror. And that is because, as I'm about to disclose to you in more detail, this is a fascination I too shared as a young reader and frankly share until today. And third, and most importantly, I would like to highlight that Moshe Allen's actions were not only destructive but also constructive, that in his vandalism, he turned the library book into a site of unsanctioned communication. Rather than burning it, after all, he ended up returning the book to the library, where other readers, in fact, followed him in signing their own names. So right below his name, you can see another guy, for some reason, signed his name twice. I don't know, I can't read Latin cursive to save my life, but I'm told both lines say Solomon Goldberg. So, or also in offering their own forms of vandalism against the text. And I have 2 more examples for that. So on the right-hand side, you can see a different form of vandalism. So on the right-hand side, on the top row, the vandalist scratched out the ink rather than striking it over or crossing it over with a pen, etching it out, scrapping it out. And on the left-hand side, you can see vandalism with a different pen. So Moshe Aaron's vandalism was in pencil, and here we have another reader, maybe it's Solomon Goldberg, who also signed his name with a blue pen. So we have here sort of an expansive, infectious vandalism. The physical volume, in other words, became a site in which animosity towards the book's producers was exchanged in fact, infectious and expansive acts of vandalism. So the 3 points that I outlined will guide the rest of my talk today. And I'll leave that aside for now. So the first point was books and reading as social institutions and defiance against them. Reading taste and reading practice. Why is it that he turns to these specific kinds of texts? And the third is the break with tradition as a constructive and communal and communicative act rather than an act of destruction. So as I said, to answer some of the questions in the invitation to this event, like what do ex-Orthodox Jews have to offer the communities they join or those they left, or what resources they draw on from their Orthodox upbringing, I want to use these points drawn from Moshe Aaron Lev's case to share with you how my OTD experience has influenced my research and my approach to literature, to reading literature as a literary scholar. So let's start with the first point on private acts of reading as moments of rebellion and defiance against the social institution of books and reading. So I don't need to explain to this particular audience how Orthodox educational systems train their students to read a certain way, how they make us comply with certain approaches to reading, teaching a shared understanding about what one can or cannot do with texts. What I would like to remind us is that other social institutions like libraries, academia, the literary world, are equally invested in conditioning readers to read in certain ways. With the emergence of literature as a practice of mass culture, for example, intellectuals sought to train readers to adhere to rules of what they thought of as literary propriety. Different genres should be approached differently, right? You're not supposed to read an instruction manual for piety and devotion, or a liturgy for pleasure, or pulp fiction in order to edify yourself. One must read in a chronological order, right? Cover to cover, start to finish. Selective reading is prohibited. Physical books should be treated in a certain way, and so on. That academic training and scholarship also have their own protocols and procedures and traditions on how to interpret text and data are almost too obvious to necessitate examples. But paying attention to readers like Moshe Aaron alerts me to the fact that against these norms promoted by various actors, writers, publishers, translators, editors, librarians, educators, etc., readers always remain free agents, and this is really what guides me here, right? Readers do with texts as they wish. They misread, they plagiarize, they vandalize, they defy the expectations set to them as readers, and most importantly, they find pleasure where they aren't supposed to. To illustrate that, I wish to move to the second part, the second point I made about Moshe Aaron, his taste as a reader. His choice of reading materials, why he focused on the text on the catastrophe. So as I flip through the vandalized pages, skimming through graphic depictions of brutality during the Khmelnytsky massacres, I get sucked in. A memory comes to mind. Khmelnytsky. Yeah. A memory comes to mind. Shabbos afternoon, everyone's asleep, nothing to do. I pull out various books from the bookshelf looking for something exciting. The books of Kinnis, or liturgical laments, are particularly accommodating for my developing appetite. Bellies torn open and filled with feathers, children cooked by the hands of their own merciful mothers, the blood of the people of Israel spilled like water, heads decapitated, bodies piling up. Is all that revolting? Yes. Yes, it is. Is the history of anti-Jewish persecution and violence horrifying? Yes, obviously. But none of that stopped me from having a great time. I want to pause here for a second to note that the intergenerational trauma that was invoked during this conference a few times, in other words, is painful. But I want to deliberate on how the search for pleasure can offer ways to rework and challenge the political and often racist conclusions and orthodoxies that other modes of engaging with violent and traumatic past have presented to us as the only acceptable interpretation and the only acceptable conclusion, right? It's not lost on me that we are in a moment of terrible, unbearable suffering, witnessing an unparalleled devastation of Palestinian life and culture and peoplehood. And so the question becomes how we can envision new ways to deal with the narratives of brutality, right? With that violent past and present of violence. How we can find other ways of thinking about them and with them as we look into a different kind of future, hopefully different. But to go back to my reading journey, the books of the prophets were also a great source of pleasure for me. And those you could read in class, right, because you have the Chumash in the classroom, instead of listening in boredom to your teacher. Yael killing Sisra, excellent stuff, right? Ehud stabbing Eglon, king of Moab, until something spills out. This is what the biblical text tells us. And the medieval commentators argue if that word, Parshedona, is his guts that's being spilled out, or his shit, and we don't know. But I can't put down the Mikraot Gdolot, right, the Chumash with the commentary. Rahab, who hosts the spies in the book of Joshua, is an Isha Zona, a prostitute. Then Rashi ruins my party by clarifying that, in fact, a Zona is not a prostitute, but a woman who sells food, which is a little bit disappointing, I know. But later on in the book of Judges, when we are told that Yiftach HaGiladi was the son of an equally Isha Zona, Rashi all of a sudden has nothing to say. I win. Many years later, I come to thinking that maybe studying Talmud would deliver me from my awkward predicament, and so I go to seminary. Late one night, I'm studying Chagiga with a friend when we stumble into a cross-reference that listed different pejoratives for the vagina in other tractates, like place of weakness, place of impurity, oisa hamokaim, that we saw yesterday in the film, as well as my favorite, lower beard, zakan tachton. It's a powerful encounter and a peculiar way to come to terms with one's own sexuality, right? I saw the female body there, both as my own and my object of desire, alienated and textually mutilated. I could read the Talmudic text, but was never to be its intended reader, right? And my desires could never align with those of the text. I was reading it from behind the mechitza, peeping into a conversation I was decidedly uninvited to join. But you're probably already guessing where this is going. After all, that sense of voyeurism in itself inevitably produces a very odd kind of pleasure. The point is that when you have a limited library, you make do with what you've got. You can read stuff into the text, out of it, read through it. You can change the focus. You can identify with the antagonist over the protagonist. You can misread and misinterpret intentionally. You can tear it out of context, or alternately read it so radically within context, read it so closely until the texture of the text eventually disintegrates completely. What I would like to argue is that those are important tactics, hacks, modes of workarounds, nonlinear makeshift reading techniques, particularly OTD techniques of reading, and that they are interesting and productive. They allow you to figure out your relationship to the text anew. No longer its adversary, nor its ally, neither its follower nor detractor, completely consumed by the text, but still somehow its master. To bring this towards conclusion, I want to go back to the third point that I made about Moshe Allen's case. That is, his acts of vandalism were not only destructive, but also constructive, for they turned the library book into a communal site of communication and shared experience. In the intimacy and seclusion of modern secular reading habits, in which you're supposed to sit down and read quietly and on your own, the radical potentialities of reading so rarely receive proper attention. But our private moments of misalignment, misidentification, misreading, I believe, are something to be explored. In my research and writing about Hebrew and Yiddish literatures, I therefore focus precisely on these moments of misreading, and more broadly on what I think of as a range of textual malpractices, mistranslation, plagiarism, vandalism, graphomania, and so on. Such acts of literary impropriety are rebellious and revolutionary, iconoclastic as much as they are creative. And they are therefore productive for me because they reveal the force of textual instability and multiplicity, and they allow me to tell new stories of Hebrew and Yiddish literatures or in new ways and configure new angles to deal with the challenges posed to us as we write that history of those literatures. And so to answer the question that this event addresses, right, what does the OTD experience have to offer our wider communities? I want to say that I learned how to read through rebellion, through the experience of figuring out my way in a limited library, and that this common, very common OTD experience is something that allows me to question inherited traditions of reading, whether those traditions are those of the frum world or those of academia, right? And not only question them, but also kind of refurbish them and offer new ways out of intellectual, theological, epistemological, and social dead ends. I want to suggest that we think of the three aspects of Moshe Allen's vandalism, which I outlined, his defiance, his passion for the text, as well as his creative and constructive aspects of his vandalism, as OTD reading. It is this kind of reading sensibilities, that I leaned to as a child, which I wish to cherish as a scholar, right? Rather than dismiss the childish, gleeful giggle at the obscene and the grotesque, right, or the adolescent fascination with the forbidden, I propose that we give it proper attention, that we lean particularly into these sort of embarrassing, childish sensibilities. I propose that we give it proper attention as an OTD mode of reading, to give attention to the desire both for the text and the desire to undo the text, to relish in misreading it as a revolutionary practice, to honor what the organizers of this event have called OTD naches, a very specific kind of pleasure and intellectual exercise, neither fully divorced from traditional textuality, nor fully willing to subscribe to it, or in fact maybe completely unwilling to subscribe to it, refusing to subject oneself to the rigid boundaries of the Orthodox or traditional narratives and fictions about knowledge, training, and education, right? Whether those are of the Orthodox community or of academia. Moshe Allen's story is neither a tragic nor a triumphant story, and perhaps it is both. And so my proposition here is a mode of thinking about the OTD experience and the OTD engagement with the text that builds on the ruptured, pleasurable, and revolutionary prospects of reading after Orthodoxy. Thank you.
All right, so we're now going to take questions from the audience. Raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll come over with the mic.
Thank you so much. Those were both moving and interesting and just a pleasure to hear. Roni, I loved everything that you were saying. It felt inspiring for me. It felt in some ways quite new. It had me in mind of Jacques Derrida and deconstruction and what is the text doing behind its own back. And as I think back to my readings of women's stories of religious exit from a variety of different religions, so many of them, there was an undercurrent, an unspokenness through their stories of desire, of longing. And we spend so much time talking about what has pushed us away from our religious communities. And I'm just fascinated by what you talked a little bit about pleasure and desire and finding that, and that which pulls us into something new and maybe even to something delightful. And it seems like a part of your, I don't know if you would call it a deconstructive reading, but is looking for that hidden pleasure in the text. And I'd love to know more about what role you see this plays, the role of pleasure and desire in religious exit.
Yeah, that's great. I was thinking precisely about these things as you were talking yesterday, so thank you for that. Yeah, I think that you actually articulated it in an amazing way. We need to think about the things that pull us, not only that push us out, but pull us inwards into a new thing, but also to cherish and honor the pleasurable bits that we can carry over. There's that process of a breakage, right? Breaking out from the world that you left. We so often focus on the moment of rupture, but and on the things that we lose, right? When you lose your community, you lose social capital, you lose often actual capital or support, right? And so we tend to think about all the things that we lose, but I'm trying to think about the things that we can translate, that we can carry over, the baggage that is not only traumatic, but also the things that give us a sense of happiness, yes, of desire. And I think a lot about childhood in that context. Yeah, we were able to find joy in things, and what were they, and how can we carry them into the new arrangement in our life.
Hey, before I ask my question, I just want to give a quick shout out to Baruch Thaler. I know you mentioned him yesterday, Shoal. He's one of the founders in a lot of ways of this OTD movement here, and very innovative, and also Ellie Moseson, who's not here also, both very instrumental people. If you haven't come across them, worth looking up, and I can offer some resources. Thank you, Roni, for that focus on pleasure. I think that's so powerful and important. The question I have, though, is for Shaul. Two things. When we were at Hartman, you also brought up this Reb Zalman piece of this focus on really, right, sending outwards, and the piece that you brought from 93, I think it was, from the press, right? So there's two questions. One is, do you see this as the integral kind of piece that Reb Zalman brought to Judaism? I know there's so many things, right? Is this the core of his teachings and what he brought? And the second part is practically, thinking about Maslow's hierarchical, needs and so on. How do we, if we are constantly threatened at different points, how do we actually do that on a practical level, right? Like, how do we take that vision and do it when there is this rise in anti-Semitism all of a sudden, and there is, right? How do we do that on a practical level?
That's, of course, the operative question in many ways. I think, I don't know if I would say for him it was a core. It certainly was a fundamental oppositional resistance to the inclination of Jews to enclose themselves as a response to the Nazi genocide, of which, of course, as we know, Zalman came very close to, and I think really deeply influenced him in a lot of ways. How, in light of that, and in light of today, how can Judaism be unafraid of the world? And I think that for him, if it can't do that, it will have lost its core. Jacob Neusner, the renowned scholar of rabbinics and many other things, once made in a passing comment something that I think really I found is instructive. He said that if the Jew, he said this in the 1970s, if the Jews can't somehow be able to process and overcome, not to forget, not to erase, but to overcome the trauma of the Shoah, then they will survive, but they won't be a very interesting people. And I think there's something in Zalman that carries that message also. Now, this is not discounting any of the issues that exist in the world that we live in, but my experience of his vision is that the most powerful antidote to animus against Jews is an expansive Judaism, a Judaism that reaches out to the world. Now, one can call that naive, but I feel like the retreat into a certain kind of survivalist mode, in however it takes form, in many different kind of forms, is not actually using the very resources that we as a people have. And it is a gigantic enterprise. It is countercultural, it's counterintuitive, it's dissonant. It's the opposite of the way we as human beings would react to the kinds of things that we are confronted with. And yet I think he would still maintain that that is the work that we have to do. Yeah.
So I was thinking about how Rashi is very easy to read differently because there's no nakudot, there's no punctuation. You can make words flow and tense them differently, and I used to do that every day in elementary school. So thank you for telling me it's a heretical reading all the way back then. And I appreciate these conversations and perspectives of how to look at things so differently than the way we were raised, and be okay with yourself for getting all the milim wrong on the Chumash test.
All right, we'll take one final question before ending.
Shaul, is it?
Yes.
Like a two-part question. So what do you see as the difference between heresy, as you describe it, and atheism? And how do you see Judaism without God?
Just a brief final question for. It's funny because if you want to go back to the rabbinic source of what we would call minut, which would be the closest correlation to heresy in the rabbinic corpus, it would be Elisha ben Avuya, who says, leit din v'leit dayan, which in a certain sense, there is no judge and there is no judgment, which in a certain sense is a rabbinic expression of atheism, of sorts. I just think that in a sense, while atheism might be an exercise in heresy, I don't necessarily think that it's a threatening one for those that live inside the orbit of Judaism. I think the more threatening one would be a reconstruction and reconsideration of the divine in a way that would justify or necessitate the rupture of normativity. That's threatening. To say that there is no God, first of all, I think that to say there is no God doesn't necessarily mean that I'm not going to do mitzvahs, right? There are many reasons to do mitzvahs. You just want to be a part of community. It's meaningful to you. In a certain sense, there is a way of articulating a Orthodox view of life that can say, what does God have to do with it? Right? Right. Okay. Okay. Yeah, okay. So I think on the atheism question, now, Judaism without God, people have been thinking about that for hundreds and hundreds of years. Somebody, I don't remember who, if they're in the audience today, showed me a copy of Isaac Deutscher's The Non-Jewish Jew, which is a fascinating book. In a certain sense, the non-Jewish Jew is the beginning of a history of Jewish heresy, right? That the Jewish heretics are the real Jewish heroes. Deutscher himself was a Trotskyite, right? Wrote a 3-volume biography of Trotsky. And a Polish Jew who was in England. A fascinating person. So I think, what do we mean? First of all, and we have to enter a whole other conversation about what do we mean by God. And, was Spinoza an atheist? No, he wasn't an atheist. In fact, Novalis called Spinoza a God-intoxicated man. I mean, the problem with Spinoza wasn't atheism. There was too much theism, right? Right? What he was an atheist, meaning that he didn't believe in the biblical God. He didn't believe in the commanding God. He didn't believe in the providential God. But he believed that we were all living inside of God. So when you talk about it in terms of belief in God, I assume you mean a covenantal God, a God that commands, a God that rewards, a God that punishes. And I think that Jews have not believed in that in all kinds of ways for millennia. It's not clear to me that the Zohar's God is that kind of God, that Maimonides' God is that kind of God. So I think that there is no static view of what God is, or normative view of what God is. God is, in a sense, always being manipulated, reconstructed, and Feuerbach, of course, was right, that we create the image of God. If human beings are created in the image of man, we're creating the image of God. And there's nothing that's heretical about that. I mean, Jews have been doing that for a long time. The God of Leviticus is not the God of the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, right? Now, ostensibly it is, but if you look at it under a microscope, it's a little bit more problematic. So I think it's, as Arthur Waskow titled his book, it's about God wrestling. Not only with God, but in how one understands God. And I think that's part of the process, that's part of the project that I think all of us are engaged with. I just want to say one more thing, just in terms of neat. There is another very interesting depiction of female genitalia in the Zohar, Zion. Think about that. Maybe take one more question, because I don't want to end on that.
I wasn't given the Zohar to read in elementary school.
Okay.
So.
That's why you weren't given the Zohar to read.
Shkayach, big shkayach. Zion. Yeah, I have a few questions. We'll see what comes forth. I'm doing my master's right now studying heresy and madness and trying to come at this question of heresy through an anti-psychiatric lens that wants to situate the Bible and the discourse hermeneutically and psychoanalytically to provide context for the madness of the OTD experience. So I look forward to reading your works and being in dialogue. Yeah, I think presently there's this madness of Zion that's on my mind. And I am very inspired by thinkers like Reb Zalman about this like universalistic message, and then also feeling mad about Zion and feeling like sick that I come from a culture that is a part of this so-called holy war. Yeah, and I guess the question is, where does madness fit into this work of like Reb Zalman? Yeah, like where do we go from here? Like I think there's, on the one hand, I'm here for the hot take, like for the new takes of the Torah of saying like, oh yes, let's universalize, let's this, and then also growing up, like learning about how God commands us to do genocide and the like, you know, like what do we, and of course we could look at the Bible as a literary, you know, as a history piece, but now it's it's used as a talking book for all of us. So.
Can I just suggest another term? I mean, I like the madness, and Tzvi Mark wrote a book called Mysticism and Madness about Nachman of Bratslav, right? So, right. And the other term that I think is worth thinking about in regard to the question that you asked or the comment that you made is hypnosis. And in the 1920s. There are at least two Jewish thinkers I know that I'll mention who were probably playing off of early psychoanalytic theory and used the term hypnosis. The first one is Aaron Shmuel Tamaris in his Knesset Yisrael U'Melchomot HaGoyim. Uses this term hypnosis to argue that the Jews have been hypnotized by nationalism. And because nationalism is coming up through Western Europe in the formation of nation states and so on and so forth, and that for him Zionism was being hypnotized by nationalism to become like the nations. And the second iteration is an Aaron David Gordon, an early Zionist thinker from the Second Aliyah, who basically claimed, criticizing the younger, Olim, that they became hypnotized by Marxism, and they thought that Marxism was the solution to the Jewish problem and the Jewish question. So this idea of hypnosis, in conjunction with madness, because hypnosis is a temporary state, right? And it's a state that's it's a state that's brought about by something outside that is magnetic or compelling, that ostensibly offers solutions to problems. But of course, it really doesn't, because when you're in a hypnotic state, you lose your sense of agency. That's part of what hypnosis is, for any of you that have been hypnotized. I've been hypnotized a few times. And it's fascinating. You don't lose consciousness. You lose agency. You're aware of what you're being asked to do, whether it's crawl on the floor or jump. You're being aware of being asked to do something, and yet you do them because somehow you have given up agency. And I think that's one way of thinking about the ways in which Jews or any collective gets kind of pulled and sucked into various things as responses to what are kind of intractable problems. So it might be another way to play it. And hypnosis was very much at play in the 1920s in the psychoanalytic world. Can I say one thing just about Roni's paper, which I loved? I think that what was so fascinating about it is really getting a window into how a person at a different period of time is engaging in the heretical enterprise of reading by being deeply invested in the tradition. Right? Not closing the book and say, oh, I'm going to go read Melville, but to actually work through hermeneutically, linguistically, with all kinds of word plays. That is, in a certain sense, the hermeneutics of heresy. And it's just a great window as an exemplar of what some of us do, what some of us want to do, what maybe we should do, what many of us have the linguistic skills to do, whereas many other Jews who did not have the experience that we had don't have those skills to do. So thank you for that.
All right, thank you, Shaul. Thank you, Roni, for those wonderful presentations and reflections. And now we'll have Zalman Nealfield come to the stage to offer some closing remarks.
Thank you, Roni and Shaul, for these wonderful papers. Thank you to everyone who participated, who contributed their genius, their creativity, their empathy, their feelings. I think so many people came over to me over the past 2 days and said how meaningful this conference and festival was. I think that a lot of us who are here in person or who experienced it on Zoom will be spending the coming weeks and months thinking about it, reflecting on it, and for me it's been just a tremendous experience. And I want to thank so much Naomi Seidman, of course, who came up with this idea and pushed it. And to all the amazing staff at YIVO who hosted us and made sure that everything worked out just as beautifully as it did. Thank you so much. I also want to be sure to thank all of our co-sponsors, the Hunter College Jewish Studies Center, the Footsteps here in New York, the Hillel organization in Israel, and the Social Science Research Council in Canada. Thank you all so much for making this possible, and thank you so much to all those who attended and provided such amazing questions and comments and support. Thank you all so very much. Thank you. Thank you.